Hello, my name is Kris Descovich. I'm an animal welfare scientist in the School of Veterinary Science at the University of Queensland in Australia. And today I'm going to talk to you about animal welfare and the relationship with facial expressions in animals. I'm going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind tour of this topic, and I'm going to touch on how to measure it, what it could mean, some tips from using it, and what context it might be useful to think about facial expressions in our animals when we're managing them. Okay, so firstly, what exactly is a facial expression? Well, facial expressions tend to be researched in two different fields. The first really looks at facial expressions as a communicative gesture. So essentially in that context, facial expression is a gesture executed with the facial muscles. The other field of research tends to focus on how emotional states and affective states are expressed through the face and then are manifest as a facial expression. Now, of course, facial expressions serve both purposes, and these exist simultaneously. So we can be expressing a facial expression both as a communicated gesture while also experiencing an associated emotional state that links into our facial expression. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to define facial expressions as any movements derived from either individual or combined facial muscle activation, including eye widening, rolling or blinking, tongue movements when visible, and even ear movements because they're also moved by the facial muscles. Okay, so firstly, how do we actually measure and monitor facial expressions in animals? And there are several different ways that we do that. The first system that you might come across for measuring facial expressions is called the Facial Action Coding System, or FACS. Now, FACS is an anatomically based system for coding individual muscle activation in the face. And these muscle activations we call action units and action descriptors. FACS was originally designed for humans in a human FACS system, particularly for understanding emotional facial expressions in humans. But now there are a variety of adapted FACS systems for lots of different species. So there's a chimp FACS for chimpanzees, a Mac FACS for macaques, a cat FACS, a dog FACS, etc. So there are quite a few different FACS systems now. Now, FACS systems are quite objective because they really do focus on that individual muscle activation. So for example, if I have a neutral face, and then I have activation of action unit 12, which is our smiling muscle, it would look like this. If I wanted to code action units 25, 26, and 27, that's lip parting, jaw dropping, and jaw stretching, that would look like this. So you can see focusing on these individual muscle movements can be quite objective because we're not looking at a whole range of activation that's happening at the same time. But as you've probably already picked up, it's a very time-consuming way to actually code facial expressions. The next kind of system uses a categorized muscle combinations where we then add a label to these combinations. And we do this, for example, when we label, say, a smile, because it's actually a combination of muscles that will occur. Now, these muscle combinations and the labels that are put on those categories, they're often used in communication studies. They can be very species specific, and they're often linked to specific social or environmental contexts. So for example, we see the macaque in the clip. This is a macaque is giving a lip smacking behavior. And other examples of these kinds of label combinations are things like fear grimace and also play face. Now, these muscle combinations, they can also be multimodal. And so if an animal is, say, vocalizing, that vocalization can have both a visual and an auditory component. Another tool that you'll come across are the grimace scales, and I'm not going to touch on them now because we're going to come back to this a little later on. One other option we can try is looking at asymmetry of facial expressions. Now, asymmetry is when one side of the face is activating in a different way to the other side of the face. It could be in terms of the muscles that are activating, it could be in terms of how intense that muscle activation is, or it could be in terms of the speed of muscle activation. So to demonstrate this, I have this very attractive photo of myself where I'm pulling a asymmetrical facial expression. And to show you properly that the facial expression is asymmetrical, I've made these two nice composites, one of the left side and one of the right side. And of course, faces are actually asymmetrical anyway, but you can clearly see that the facial expression I'm pulling here in this very attractive way is quite asymmetrical. Now, in animals, this asymmetry of our face can actually be an indicator of overall animal health. But when it comes to facial expression, the reasons for making these facial expressions or triggering these facial expressions can actually have an emotional component. So we know that both humans and chimpanzees tend to have strong, more activation on the left side of their face when they're experiencing stronger emotional expressions. Similarly, dogs activate the left side of their face more strongly when they're reunited with their owner compared to when they're meeting strangers. And in many species, asymmetrical ear positions have been studied as well. And we know that in certain circumstances, those ear positions will become more asymmetrical, and one ear may activate more commonly or in a stronger way than the other ear. The last method that I'll touch on is automated monitoring, and this is really an extension of some of the other methods that we use. So automated monitoring means we place facial landmarks on an image of an animal or perhaps on a video of an animal, and then a computer program is coded so that these facial landmarks and their relationships to each other can then be automatically determined. There are some tricks with doing this. For example, if you're working with group housed animals, then of course the system also needs to be able to individually recognize different individuals within that group. And they also still need to be manually validated. So these systems are mostly at the experimental stage in terms of people are using them in research, but most of the systems that are being used are still at the bespoke research stage where individual research teams are actually developing these and applying them. Okay, so what is the use of facial expressions for welfare? Now, as I mentioned before, we can look at facial expressions from a communication point of view, and we can also look at them from an affective state point of view. But really, regardless of the mechanism or function, facial expressions are still very useful in terms of understanding an animal's intention and experience and their perception of the world around them. It can allow us to assist with animal management decisions, and it can really help us to make decisions for animals and on their behalf that might allow us to lead to conditions that improve, facilitate positive welfare for those animals. So let's take a closer look at this. Okay, if we consider facial communication in agonistic context, so in terms of context where there's social conflict, perhaps even aggression. Now, when we have captive animal management, let's say we're working with a group of captive monkeys, then we can, aggression can be one of those things that we need to keep an eye on because it can be a significant concern in group housed animals. They can do a lot of damage to each other. And so if we understand the communication cues of our animals, that can help us potentially mitigate the situation or remove vulnerable animals or apply management strategies in other ways that help us to, avoid severe aggression. Okay, so let's look at what this might look like. Now, let's say in our monkey group, we have two animals that are engaged in this interaction. The first is a signaler monkey. This is the one that will generate the facial expression. And the other one is a receiver monkey. So this is the one that the facial expression is directed towards. And of course, when we're dealing with group animals, there are often bystanders as well. Okay, so the signaler makes this facial expression, which in this case could be a threat face. The receiver sees this threat face, and then seeing this cue, this predictor of impending behaviour lets the receiver make some decisions about what they're going to do. Are they going to provide an affiliative face that might dampen the chance of social conflict? Or are they going to avoid the situation? They might run away or completely avoid eye contact with the signaller. Or are they going to make the choice to actually escalate the conflict and perhaps even signal some threats back to them? Now, of course, the bystander also has several choices, so they can also see the signal and receiver. They can also choose to de-escalate the situation or perhaps escape the situation or engage in social conflict themselves. So facial expressions signal intent and impending behaviour. They allow us to predict what might happen next. And this in turn allows receivers and bystanders to de-escalate, avoid, or engage in conflict. This, of course, all helps to actually reduce the cost of actual conflict, because actual aggression has a risk of injury, even death. And by making these cues, that can help us reduce actual conflict. Now, of course, if we're talking about an environment such as a zoo environment, it is not always the animals that are the receivers and bystanders, and it could very well be a zookeeper in that situation. And a savvy zookeeper who understands the facial expressions that animals giving them may be able to remove themselves from a potentially dangerous situation or change their behavior in some way that reduces the chance of conflict. Facial communication can also help in ambiguous contexts because animals are continuously gaining contextual information from each other. And when they're trying to make sense of their environment, any cues that they can use to make the correct decisions about their environment can have significant fitness benefits. Are there threats in their environment that they need to avoid? Are there rewards in their environment that they need to access? And part of those cues come from their social environment. Okay, so in this, let's go back to our group of monkeys. Let's say this little monkey is now the signaler. They found a novel object in their enclosure, which is a box, and the receiver is interested. What is that box? It could be a threat. It could be a reward. The signaler looks inside, and judging on its facial expression and body language, the receiver can make the decision about what that box might be. So this is important because what we know for animal welfare is that animals that are in very unpredictable environments, but particularly when that unpredictability is related to unpleasant events, we know that can be very detrimental for welfare. So often improving predictability of the environment and control that the animal has over their environment can be very good for welfare. It's important to note here that this can also lead to unintended associative learning. So let's say I'm a zookeeper. I have a nice novel object for my animal that I think it will enjoy, but I've made the mistake of coming into work without having my morning coffee. And this dangerously undercaffeinated state means that my body language is giving off unintended signals. It might be my body, it could also be my facial expressions. And so what I have is a neutral or positive object, but my animal may actually read my facial expression and it may interpret the situation as being negative. So we do have to be aware that many species can actually read our facial expressions, and that doesn't include just animals such as primates. It also includes animals such as dogs and goats. So they can read our facial expressions and they can understand when we're feeling a little bit grumpy. Okay, so moving now to the side of facial expressions with affective states. And by affective states, I mean things like emotions, moods, and feelings. Now, these are very important for animal management when we want to maintain good standards of welfare in our animals. Now, if we think about animal emotions, we can use several different frameworks, but I just find this emotional compass to be very useful because it allows us to think about emotions, any emotion really, and describe that emotion in terms of two important axes. The first is this axis that goes from positive to negative valence. Positive valence means the emotion they're feeling will be pleasurable, and negative valence means the emotion they're feeling will be unpleasant. And the other axis, the vertical one here, goes from high arousal to low arousal. So when the animals are in a high arousal state, it means they're very intense, and a high arousal positive state could be something like excitement, while a low arousal positive state could be something like contentment. So you can see how an emotion could be placed anywhere within one of these 4 quadrants. Now, this is important for welfare because when we're managing animals, we like to try and keep them on this side of the valence. We like to have almost all, as much as possible, animals feeling at least neutral to positive emotions and feelings and states. Of course, animals do fluctuate just like humans do, and no animal and no human will always be on this side. But as much as we can, we like to keep them here. Now, it's not just this valence that's important for animal management and animal welfare. Arousal can be quite important too. So in my experience, although high arousal positive states can be very rewarding for animals, high arousal states can easily go from positive to negative. So for example, an animal that's highly anticipative of an important event, they can very quickly flip to highly frustrated as well. And some of the animals that we might work with may be much larger than us and much stronger than us. And so if that's the situation, then a high arousal positive animal can also be a little bit dangerous. So a highly excited horse or any of those kinds of animals, from an animal management point of view, we do also have to be a little bit careful about the situations that might be dangerous to us. So for welfare, this is, in my opinion, the most important quadrant, but the positive side is all very important, and animals will move between all 4 of these quadrants throughout their life. So what does it have to do with facial expression? Well, we can use facial expression to make interpretations on these internal states, these affective states of animals. One of the most common indicators that we might look for is eye aperture, which is actually this widening of the eyes you can see in this picture here. Now, in humans, eyes widen with emotions such as fear and surprise. And the muscle that's responsible for this is widely conserved across many, many species: dogs, monkeys, cows, horses. So if you're working in facial expressions in many species, you will come across this behavior. Now, in terms of vigilance to threat, widened eyes plays a very important role in our fitness and survival. And that's because, of course, as we open our eyes wider, we have increased visual field, we have greater sensory intake from that, which improves our vigilance and our levels of attention. And of course, if there's a genuine threat, that does improve our survival. In animals as well, we know that eye aperture widening and the visibility of eye wide in many species, such as cows, also tends to increase in aversive situations, so potential threat situations. It's also negatively correlated with parasympathetic nervous system activation, and it also reduces, so the eye aperture closes with things like sedatives, analgesia, and anxiolytics. Okay, now that all sounds very straightforward, but of course facial expressions are actually somewhat complex, and so it's not quite that straightforward. And reduced eye aperture, if we're looking at the cinching of the eyes, well, in humans, this can actually occur in contexts where there's negative affect, so for example, anger. And it can also occur in positive affect situations such as contentment. And you can see in these 2 pictures here, these are of different people, but both of them have cinched eyes in. However, one of them has a positive emotional expression and the other one has a negative emotional expression. And I would think that just by looking at these, even though they both have cinched in eyes, you could probably take a pretty good guess at which one is a negative affect picture and which one is a positive affect picture. And this is also seen in animals. So for example, again, we have 2 pictures of cats. One is very different from the other, but both of them have this reduced eye aperture. And again, I think you could take a pretty good guess that this one is the one of negative emotional expression, and this is one of positive emotional expression. And the reason for that is we're not just looking at one individual muscle activation, we're actually looking for a wider context. And you can see this is actually quite a complex facial expression. There's actually a lot of muscle activation in the nose here, in the top of the eyes, and here as well. While this is quite a relaxed facial expression. So these differences are perceivable and observable and measurable, but the combination of these contributing muscles is important. And the other important indicator is just general facial tension. How much is the face actually, how much are the facial muscles being held in tension or not? And that can be a very good indicator of arousal, but also valence. So what are the kind of situations where we might expect to see some positive facial expressions? Well, we might just see a general positive welfare state. So we may just have a very relaxed facial expression. We may also see specific play faces. So for example, a relaxed open mouth in dogs, like we see here. We may also see affiliative behaviour. So affiliative behaviour is that social bonding behaviour. But I note here that to do that with caution. So for example, in monkeys, affiliative behaviour might be that lip smacking behaviour we saw previously with the macaque. But affiliative behaviour can also happen in conflict situations because of course it's really about getting along with other monkeys. So it can say to them, look, I'm not a threat, I don't want conflict. We might also see specific facial expressions associated with sexual motivation, which we assume is a very positive experience for animals. And we may see facial expressions in either anticipation of or in response to some preferred stimuli. So they're facial expressions as they experience sweet taste solutions if they're an animal that likes sugary water, for example. Now, a really important context for animal welfare and facial expression is the context of pain. Now, of course, an animal that's in pain is not an animal that has good welfare. And pain management is a very key concept for high welfare animal management. But it requires us to be reliable in identifying pain because we may know an animal is just not feeling themselves, but we may not be able to know necessarily whether that's pain or nausea or fear. Being able to determine these different states is really important for identifying the appropriate treatment going forward. Now, humans actually have a prototypical pain face. It looks a bit like this, a bit of a grimace. But of course, there are lots of ways that this may manifest. There are individual differences, there are cultural differences, there are age-related differences. So it's not a single pain face, but rather a variation or a range. And similarly, in other mammals, there's extensive evidence that a lot of mammals do just demonstrate facial changes as a result of pain states. So remember I said we would come back to the grimace scales, and this is where I wanted to cover them. So what you're looking at here is actually the rabbit grimace scale. Now, grimace scales are a particular way of coding facial expression, and they have been generally developed specifically for pain identification. And predominantly they're around animals that are used in bioscience, but not strictly. There are grimace scales for animals such as farm animals. Now, they're all different because they're species specific, but you can see for the rabbit grimace scale that there are 5 different indicators: eye tightening, cheek flattening, nose shape, whisker position, and ear position. And for each indicator, there are 3 intensities. One is where there is no pain evidently present. One is where it looks like it's moderately present, and one where it's obviously present. And you can see the same for each indicator. And so using a grimace scale like this, we can actually get a quantitative score about what their pain state may be. Now, while I've presented the rabbit grimace scale here, there are actually a range of ones, as I mentioned before, for different species. And a really good resource to check out if you're interested in this topic is the NC3R's website from the UK, and that has a range of printable posters on grimace scales. Okay, so now we've learnt a little bit about facial expressions in animals and why it might be useful. But I think it's important to also understand the limitations, particularly because humans, we rely very heavily on facial expressions. We use them informally all the time, every day, and that may cause us to make some assumptions when we're applying them to other species. And there are just some things to be wary of, I would say. The first thing is that there are practical implications of using facial expressions, particularly in research. Systematic coding can be very time consuming. It can require considerable training and even an accreditation process if you're using particular techniques such as FACS. Animal morphology can affect the view that you have, and it can also affect facial mobility. So if you're monitoring brachycephalic animals, like flat-faced animals, they may not have the facial movement that other breeds have for that species. Similarly, some coat colors may make it difficult to understand facial expressions. So a black animal, for example, you may not be able to see muscle activation as easily as a light-colored animal. It can also be difficult to monitor animal facial expressions because they do not sit still when we ask them to. Of course, they are constantly moving about. So you may not get a very nice forward-facing facial expression. You may get a side view. You may have a face completely hidden from the view. And of course, when you're applying things like the FACS system, because it's quite difficult, what we usually do is record it, and then we slow the video down so that we can accurately measure that muscle activations on and off. Okay, think back to when I was talking about animal communication and I was talking about combinations of muscles being given, combination of muscle activation being given labels, particularly in communication studies such as a fear grimace. Now, I would say that when we're looking at animal welfare, I would be cautious about using labels that have an underlying value to them. So, for example, if I use the term fear grimace, in communication, this might be quite useful because it may be very good at predicting what behaviors happen next. But using a label like that, which has the word fear in it, might make us make some assumptions about the underlying emotional states of those animals that may not actually be the case. So I'd be a bit cautious there. Now, if I think about using facial expressions in terms of affective states and emotional displays, I would say that we have to be careful of applying human labels to some of the facial expressions that we might see with animals. For example, emotions may not show a natural kind of grouping, and different emotions may not be evident by a prototypical display. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the example of fear. How is a fear expression expressed in the face? Well, out of all the human emotions, this is an emotion that's very likely to be conserved across species, whether it's exactly what we mean by fear or not, because fear serves a key fitness and survival function. When you fear fear, you know how to protect yourself. You know to act to protect yourself. But even in humans, where we have a fear face, that expression of fear can be very varied. So if you look at all of these pictures that I've put up, I would say these are all characteristic fear faces. But they all have a lot of differences between them, right? And I think that's for two reasons. Firstly, we may not only be feeling one emotion at a time. We might have fear mixed with surprise or mixed with another emotion. Secondly, fear itself, if you think about it, it's really a category of emotions. The fear I feel when watching a child climb to the top of a playground gym is not the same fear that I feel if an intruder is suddenly in my home. And so my expression of fear in those two contexts will also be different. So really, fear is a bit more like a category of emotions. And if we think about it in that way, if we're applying these categorical emotional frameworks where we label fear and we label happiness and those emotions, we have to think about, for facial expressions, are all displays of one emotional category sufficiently the same as each other? So we're all happiness faces or fear faces sufficiently similar? And are they sufficiently different from other emotion categories? How much overlap do we get between what fear looks like and what pain looks like or another emotion? The other thing to think about is that sometimes we have issues with voluntary modulation. So how much control do we have over our facial expressions? And research suggests that we have less voluntary control over facial expressions than we do over motor movements. And particularly in humans, we know that as that emotional intensity increases, voluntary control or emotional leakage actually decreases. So we are less likely to be able to control our facial expression. However, I do know that animals can mask their behavior and mask their facial expression in some cases. And for example, if you're looking at a monkey and you're not sure if they have, if they're not feeling the best, if you're directly staring at them and you don't have a strong relationship with them, they may actually mask that behavior, including their facial behavior. All right, so how do we incorporate facial expressions practically into animal management? What context might it actually be useful for? Firstly, I would say during animal introduction and during human-animal interactions, it's important to monitor facial expressions. Are there threats? Are there affiliative behaviors? Are there affiliative expressions, sorry? Are there facial expressions that indicate a negative affective state? During training and conditioning, we can read our animal's facial expression. Are they in positive anticipation? Are they becoming frustrated? Where are we reaching the limits of our training for the day? And during things like veterinary treatment and recovery from veterinary treatment, are we seeing facial patterns that deviate from normal? What internal states might that animal be feeling as a recovery process? Could it be pain? Could it be something else like nausea? As I mentioned before, we may see some expression masking in animals. So in that case, using indirect observation of their facial expressions may be more useful than using direct observations. I would also say to be expectant of individual differences, as well as species differences, and also context-related differences. Be observant about the individuals that you're working with and what their individual reactions might be. Absolutely expect deviation from prototypical human facial expressions. If you're thinking about what a pain face or a fear face looks like in a human, it would not be necessarily species relevant to apply that to another species, even those species that have very similar facial musculature, like non-human primates. And lastly, and I would say this is my most important point, I think facial expressions can really provide some nice insight into what our animals are thinking and what they're feeling, what they're intending to do, and how they're perceiving their environment. But I do not think it should be used in isolation when we have a whole range of other welfare indicators at our disposal, that we should always use things like facial expression in combination with other indicators, including behavior, vocalizations, and animal health indicators, for example. So facial expressions are very interesting, very useful, but use them as part of your toolbox when assessing the welfare of your animals and making management decisions for good welfare. And that really brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much for having me. I'll also provide some extra resources if you would like to do some additional reading if you have a particular interest in this topic. But thank you very much.